Hey everyone. So I thought we'd do something a little different this week. I was submitted this material that you're seeing here from a patron actually, and they wanted some help on some review of the graph, see if I could help them get stuff to work a bit better. And I actually asked them if it'd be okay if we went through it all together as a video, because I think there's lots of really good stuff in here to teach. And designer is one of those things, right? Where I actually don't think there's a ton of wrong ways of doing things, right? There's lots of different ways of approaching problems that aren't necessarily better or worse. They're just different and they have different strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons. And I think going through this was a really great way to talk about some of those things. So going through the video, this is the material I wound up with at the end of the day. So I think it is improved. Some of it is just a stylistic choice or an aesthetic preference really, but along the way through the graph we definitely picked up a lot of ways that I see kind of beginners doing, or people that are maybe just kind of slightly low intermediate or something, where they're still making these decisions that I think you could probably look at a little differently. And hopefully that advice is just helpful as we work through this. I think this is something I'm going to do more of. I had a lot of fun doing it. It's really fun having other people's work and looking through it and seeing what they did and trying to think of alternate strategies. I had a ton of fun. I'm hopeful that this person finds this helpful as well. So I think I'll be doing more of these. So if you would like to support the channel, you can absolutely feel free to head over to Patreon. I'd really appreciate it. I'm going to be soliciting these sorts of things much more often just to try to get stuff in like this more regularly. So if that's something you're interested in, feel free to do so. As well, on the Patreon, I will put this graph, the finished graph for this material, up as well if you just would like to follow through with it or see where I did what, just to kind of get a grasp on that. But it was a really fun one. I'm excited about it. I think people will learn a lot. Even if you just want to follow along with the video, I think you'll learn a ton. And that's always the goal, is just for everyone to have something to take away from the video that they've never seen before, or just how to think about something a little bit differently. So let's get in that graph, to the original graph, and then we'll go through and make all those adjustments. Okay, so I had already sort of familiarized myself a little bit with the graph. I haven't moved it around much since what Roxana sent me. Just changed some stuff on the output just so that I didn't, there was a node, special node she had that I wanted to replace with this material transform. No particular reason, it was just to keep it tidier for me at least. We can go into that later, but it doesn't change much. So I think there's a lot of stuff that works here. What I especially like is that she's left these notes all over the place for herself, which I think is great. I wish more people did this, especially students. Like, I think this is a huge, like, especially because you're going to open a graph much later, right? And you might not know what you were doing. Having stuff like this is really helpful just to keep your thoughts out of your head, or keep them in your head, but also have them in the graph so that you're able to assess what you were doing when you were doing them. There's a couple things we should change here. For one thing, this is all the rock stuff. So this generates all these pebbles, which I think is fine. All of the grass blade generation stuff is here. So I think we're going to talk about this in an order of material layers. I like to always think in layers, right? So I'm not a big fan of trying to figure out the grass and the rocks and all the different components at once. I would much prefer to think about them in sections. So think about that grass layer. I'm not going to even pretend to think about the rocks for now. So I'm just going to find where the rocks lay in. And this is the other thing, is because you're doing it all in one graph, oftentimes what ends up happening is different things get blended in at different parts. Like there's not a specific spot where the rocks themselves show up, right? They're there kind of the whole way through the color process, which to me is more complicated. So what I'm going to do for now is just simply put a bit of a darker green. I like to make it a bit more blue. And blend over kind of a more yellow, brighter, less saturated green. Just to be our grass blades for now. We'll come back and address the color later, but let's think through the height map of this stuff to begin with. So there's our color. And I'm going to put in, we're going to start with just this height map. So I'm going to make a portal node here and call this final height or working height. This is just so that we can skip a bunch of the other stuff that's in our way and just deal with that later. Let's go working height. And this is all here just so that we can skip a bunch of stuff. I basically just have turned off a ton of the graph, just that I don't have to worry about it all. And we'll use this to just blend between our two colors here. And this will just give us a good idea of looking at just the grass blades, and we'll go from there. So I think this is fine. If it's me, I usually try to make these a separate graph, essentially, if I can. Meaning, I would almost always rather just have the grass blades being built in a different graph. But since they're so simple out here to make these 3 variations, I think that's probably okay. Tile sampler makes sense. I think what can be adjusted here, the reason these are getting put up, the quad transform is fine if you want to taper it. There's other ways you can taper this if you don't want to deal with the handles of the quad transform. The other reason I don't really like this is because we are going to just move that bottom. And what's important to understand with any of the tile generators is whatever the middle of this input texture is, so all of these directional warp textures get plugged into the tile sampler. It's important to understand that whatever is the center of this texture is where any rotation in the tile sampler is going to come from, where any scaling in the tile sampler comes from. We talked about this in our tile generator video. We'll be talking about like how it understands that. So just as a quick aside here, if we have a circle and we plug that into a tile sampler or generator, or splatter, like whatever you want. If we do any kind of, we'll do this. If I do any kind of rotation, they spin from their center, which if we had grass blades, we don't really want to have happen, right? We want them to spin from the bottom of the blade, like to pivot from there. So what you can do is move this so that the base of this shape is in the center of the canvas, of the 2D canvas. So I often make a tile generator and just set it to 1. So I'm just making 1 of that shape. You can automatically do this with some tools too, but for expediency, like I'll just set that to half size and move it up by 0.25. And now what you'll notice is when I rotate these, they rotate from their bottom and they scale from their bottom too. So if I go up to here and increase the size Y of these, you can see that the bottom stays put and they just grow from the bottom. So I think for the grass blades, that's going to make life much simpler. If we have to deal with it, if we can deal with it like that, that'll always be easier. So there's a couple of things here. I don't think any of this is wrong. This makes sense to me. Trying to create that kind of gradient into the middle. That makes sense to me. I don't know if I would do it. The transform's not a bad way to do this here. I would normally make a gradient myself, but this can work totally fine. Subtract is fine here too. I'd be tempted to invert it and multiply it, but that's okay. It's a pretty subtle effect anyway. This is the one that I think is more of the issue. So the way I would rather deal with this is just put these into the middle. If I wanted that sort of taper at the top, there's a lot of ways you could do it. Something that you can do is with a trapezoid transform. And then you can just set a top and bottom stretch. So I prefer to use this. You can see the duplicates coming in. And that's just because this node has tiling on. So you can just set the tiling of this node to off or to absolute. So you just go to the tiling mode up to your select the method here, absolute, and just say no tiling. I just prefer this. I'm not sure what this blur really accomplishes, but we'll just see. I'm going to put a tile generator here. And you could do a transform for this as well, but I just like the tile generator for repositioning stuff. Because I want to try to, again, put this in the center. And because it doesn't fill the full sheet, that's harder to do right now. But that's okay, we can still eyeball it. Right, so I'll just move this. And the way I just check, and obviously there's better ways of doing this, but a way I do when I'm just moving fast here is if you just put another transform node, it gives you that little circle in the center of the canvas. So you can really tell if it's in the right spot or not. So I'll just do like a tiny bit of back and forth, just scaling this down, moving it up a bit. So probably a little too far, but that's not bad actually. Move it down just a tiny bit more. And that's really good. That'll be totally fine. So I think that should basically replace all of this. The other thing that I think doesn't, this is like a lot of stuff with designer, right? It's just kind of the sequencing, like the order in which you do stuff. And like I said in the intro, I don't really think there's like a wrong way to do any of this stuff, right? There's just different approaches that have different kind of pros and cons. I think I wouldn't want to be putting the gradient over top of the blade here, because the gradient is, it's very, very little range here, like where they happen to be laying over each other. So if you were to just see it like this, there's not much variation happening because this blade is just so small right now that the gradient, it's all kind of just very close to middle gray. So I would rather apply the gradient to here while it takes up the majority of the sheet. So I'm going to plug all this stuff in for a second. We're going to swap to this. So obviously this is all going to look really crazy because the blades are way bigger, but we'll fix all that. So I do want that tile generator though. The first thing I'm going to do, we're going to get rid of all this. I'm going to blend that gradient over right here. The way I rearrange those is if I select both inputs, the nodes, or the noodles, I suppose, and hit X, they'll swap. And I think this is just simpler. There you go. Obviously, we're going to change the size and scale of these. Like, that's all really messed up right now, but that's okay. So this is fine. And then this tile generator, we were just using this transform to check that it's in the center, so we don't really need it anymore. And now we at least know that these all rotate from their centers. So there's obviously some changes we should make to these. They're a little too wide probably compared to what Roxana had envisioned, I think. So what we'll do is scale these down in specifically X. Like, let's make them thinner. Oh, that's the random. So we'll make them thinner. The other advantage this has over the old ones is now we're burying the bottoms of the grass blades. In her original one, often we could see the bottom of the blades, right? So it gives us impression that they're kind of like floating, right? Like just off the surface. Burying them down there by having the blades be quite a bit bigger so that they overlap each other hides those roots, I guess, right? The root of the grass, it sort of hides them and allows it to have, like, I think just a more consistent look, right? Like, I think this feels fluffier. So we'll do that. I think this is feeling pretty good. We'll go to, she has a bunch of settings on here, which I think makes sense. Like some scale random is nice. We have like an overall scale as well. There is some mask map threshold, but that's just, I think she's turning off the grass blades here where the rocks are. We're going to worry about all this stuff later. Same with the rotation map. We're going to deal with all that stuff quite a bit later. But I will throw a bunch of rotation random on for a sec. Let's just leave it heads up. Like, this is simpler to see for a second. There's reasons why she has those. I think she's trying to avoid the rocks. But I think there's a smarter, or not a smarter, but there's a different way of doing that I think you'll probably like better. So we'll approach that kind of after this. So this makes sense to me, just with some base settings. The problem with adding a bunch of rotation random is they tend to intersect each other a lot. And it's not great, right? You're not like super happy about that most of the time. There's ways around this there are ways to make it perfect, but I think we'll be able to play with this and get it pretty good. We'll probably do a different video at some point on like advanced blending and layering, but we'll do a little bit of it here. First though, what I want to fix, we'll add a bit of rotation random just so we have something nice to look at. These directional warps. I think this makes sense, and I think the point of this is to probably just create slightly different blade shapes. The problem with the directional warp is it's going to necessarily move them in a specific direction, right? Which may or may not be what you want. I think it's okay. The bigger problem right now is those roots are moving, right? the roots are moving away from the center, and we really do want to try to rotate from that root. Right, so if we were to look at these, right, before they go into the directional warp, they're pretty centered. But afterwards, the root moves. Some of them are more extreme than others. So we can just stop that from happening. We can go to our directional warp. Remember that in the directional warp, you just play with an intensity slider here. You pick an angle to go in. And then that input, that intensity input, you're plugging in a texture, and where it's black, the grass won't move at all. And where it's white, it'll move the full strength of the warp. So we could just put a big black circle in the middle of this to try to pin the bottom of the grass roots so that they'll never move. So that's pretty simple. We'll just make a little blend here, get a shape, and we'll grab like Gaussian or something. You can scale it down. You can even subtract this if you wanted to, but since we might bottom it out there, I prefer to invert this and multiply it. So you'll see that we'll keep the bottom of the blade anchored because they can't warp in this black space. And we might want to turn up the size of that no warp zone potentially. But I think this is more effective. I also think the blades are getting a little too wobbly. So for part of that, I think we just have too much. This is too frequent a noise, right? So I think if we zoom this down a bit more, it will feel more natural, right? At the extreme end, like let's go to the Perlin noise and really zoom it out a lot. Obviously, it's too noisy, right? Like it bends too often. So I think it's better, personally, to go over here and zoom this noise in. So we don't have nearly as much types of shape. And this works okay for just making some slight variations. Like, there's other ways you could do this. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with this. We'll leave these notes to look at later. So there's other ways you could do this. I think this is probably totally fine for now. And I think that works okay. The other thing you could do is on that tile generator, you would want to make sure that your symmetry random is up. Because what that's going to do is basically sometimes this texture input will be flipped horizontally so that we get even more variation out of it. So we might even add another noise. And we'll add a fourth grass blade type. So we'll go to the tile sampler and turn the pattern input number to 4. So we get a new input. And we'll plug that blade in just to get another version. And honestly, like they're all using the same noise to warp. That's probably okay. If you wanted it to be a bit more variety, which is always nice, right? To just have additional randomness. You could just duplicate this and just move this noise a little bit. So I made a transform node here. And I'm just going to kind of give it a random rotation, move it around. So this noise will at least be slightly different. And you could make several of those. I'll just put this out of the way up top. And so you could do this again. I'm just hitting Control D to duplicate the nodes. And we'll rotate this again. And rotate that one again. And that just gives us slightly different warps. And so each of these directional warps can have their own noise, which I think just adds a bit more variety here, and I think that's helpful. The warps are a little intense, though. But I do get the point of that, and I think it is nice to have a little bit of motion in these even before we get to the rotations. So this is fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with this. What we could do from here to make this a bit more interesting, for one thing, we should make sure that we have full value range right here. So this texture at this point, if I press the little histogram button here, it'll show you the histogram of this, and we can see we have a ton of dashed lines here, right? That don't let us, there's no values above whatever this is, right? It's pretty gray here still. So I'm going to put an auto level there first, just to make sure that we have the full value range first. Right, so see how much brighter the tip gets. That'll help with the blending and stuff like that. So I think this is fine. I think we obviously want some more variation in their rotation and stuff like that. I'm going to go down to the position random and turn that off for a second, just so that everything is stacked right on top of each other. And we're going to play a little bit with how to make this feel more flowy, essentially. So what we can do, we'll make some more room for ourselves. We can drive the rotation of these based on an input texture. So what you can do, if you see this rotation map input, and Roxana had something plugged into that earlier, this AO, and we're going to figure out, I think, a bit of a better way to do that later. But we'll see what this does. We plug in a gradient, right, into that rotation map multiplier of the tile sampler. We'll have a video on tile samplers themselves, like a know the node coming up, I think after this actually, so that'll be helpful. But if we go down to the rotation map multiplier and we put this up, what you'll see is essentially what happens is the ones that are in the black area of the gradient don't rotate. Right? See how little these are rotating at the bottom of the sheet? And the more you go up through the gradient, the more they rotate, and only clockwise. If we put this number negative, they would move counterclockwise. But these are just rotating more and more clockwise until eventually they would point right up again at the top. Right? So they start pointing up and they start spinning to the right, spinning to the right. Now they're facing to the bottom. Now they're spinning to the left, and eventually right back up top. So it isn't really telling it a direction to go into. It's just saying how much clockwise should you go, or how much counterclockwise should you go, which can be fine. What we really want to do here, I think, is have because we like this where they have kind of a flow to them. Like this feels pretty good. But I think if we had a gradient that's a bit more kind of, this is like our linear gradient, but it kind of goes in and out and in and out, right? It's like many gradients. This helps them feel a bit more coherent, right? Because they kind of flow in and out along that gradient. This also works great for fur and stuff like that. And, you can play with the scale of that noise to say how much of that you would like. The other thing that's nice about doing this is it prevents, or it helps to prevent, it doesn't stop them, but it's less likely to get intersecting blends, like where one blade crashes through another one, because they're all the one here is rotating a little bit, and this one's also rotating a similar amount. So you don't get stuff like this happening, where they just spin through each other. So I think this can help make that feel a bit better in the first place. And I like the look of this. And we're going to make adjustments to this for sure. We have a lot more to do. And I'm also going to quickly just go to the base color and make that bottom green a bit darker, just so we can see the individual blades a bit more. I'm also going to maybe turn the normal map up a bit. I also just think the blades are a little too sharp, so that may be why Roxana had that blur. So maybe it is nice to have a little bit of a blur here. So before the auto levels, I'm just going to blur that grass blade a tiny bit, so you have a bit more of an edge. That feels nicer. So that's fine. I think this works pretty well. So what we could do is add a little bit of rotation random on these as well, so it's not perfectly flowing with the wind. Right, it breaks up a little bit, which feels a bit more natural. Something like that. And I think this works pretty well. We do get some intersections. There's things we can do about that. For one thing, having some color random definitely helps, because some will get pushed lower than others. Right, if you have no color random, they often intersect with each other, right? because the max blending mode just picks the brighter of the two values for these grass blades. Terrifying. Grass blades, in order to know which ones to sort on which. The bright ones will sort on top of darker ones. But if they're all kind of similarly bright, that can be a bit of a problem. So you can pull this up so we have some more random values, and that stops them from sorting sorting against each other so much, right? There's still some, like this isn't great. We can minimize this. There's a lot of ways you could do this. What I like to do here is to actually cut out. There's some really fancy ways you can do this. I don't know how necessary that will be. And it's hard to fix it in every situation, but you can if you want to, you can. But for this video, I don't want to get super into it. So what I will do though, is I think getting rid of a lot of these, like we'll say 75%, this will just cut intersections down generally because there's less of them. There's less chances of them running into each other. And I'm going to duplicate this sampler. And here, I'm just going to get a random seed. Or the real thing, the nice tricky one here is basically what we would like to do is let's delete that fourth one for a second. That fourth input. So we'll go back down to 3. And I'm going to turn the mask random off. This is the quick and dirty way of doing this. That will get rid of a bunch of them. So I'm going to add extra pattern inputs here. So I'm going to go up to 6. And you'll see that because we've plugged nothing in here, it actually just gets rid of half of them. Because right now we only have these 3 to pick from. Like this. If we put this up to 6, I haven't plugged anything in yet, so the spawn point sort of for the blade is there, but it doesn't know what to put there. It's only just putting a black square there because there's nothing plugged in. But what we can do is duplicate this and move these to 4, 5, 6 and delete 1, 2, 3. So this creates the additional, like the missing ones from this step. And what's nice there is we can do some blending to get them to try to avoid each other, essentially. So if we just max blended these against each other, it was no different than had we just set one of them to have all 3. Or to have all 6, right? There's no difference. But what we could do first is say, hey, and we did this a little bit in the Christmas light video we made, the special Christmas material we built. What you could do is blur this a bit. So we're going to blur these grass blades a tiny bit. And I'm going to go here and subtract from those grass blades. And that's basically just going to create darkness where a blade from the second layer wants to go. And that means when we max this over top, they slot in much better. Right, so because this bottom layer has had what is going to be the top layer subtracted from it, we're sort of creating a dark space here for one of the new blades to go on top of, which helps cut down on intersections. And like I said, you can get really complicated with that. But for now, I think this will be sufficient. I think this will work okay for now. There'll be lots of opportunities to make adjustments to this later. So I actually think this is probably okay for the grass blades. There's a lot more we can do to improve it for sure, but I think we can move on to other stuff. I do think we are going to need to use rotation map stuff. There's things we need to do. But we'll come back to this stuff later. I do think this is an improvement. The other thing we probably want to do, because this is our currently kind of our working height map, I kind of want the grass blades to themselves have a bit of variance in height. Like right now, we're imagining a perfectly flat ground, which is like our black. And then we're just putting blades over it. But I wouldn't mind the terrain to have a bit of bumpiness that the blades are on top of. So you can even do something like blur the grass blades a bunch. And then auto level this just so that we're full. And you can blend this in slightly with like a screen or something. And this will just create some kind of bump. And we may even do it later on in another normal. But this just helps create some variation, which I like. Now that we have these as two separate things, anytime we want to control a parameter, we have to change it on the other one. We don't have to, but we'd probably like to. So for instance, if we want to change the scale of the grass blades, it would be annoying to have to chase this number around, right? We want this to be 30. Now we have to go back and change the other one and keep going and going. So if we know there's something we want to change, we can expose this, right? And we'll call this blade scale. And you'll see this goes blue, which means we can't play with it here now. But if we double click anywhere on the name of the graph in the Explorer or on the parent, right? So anywhere in the empty graph, and we zoom down here to input parameters, this is where it lives now. And we can play with the slider here. So why do you want that? Well, it's because this number is accessible by all the other nodes now. So we can go to our second tile sampler, go to the scale, and if we click on the little hamburger menu again, instead of exposing this one, we can actually just link it to an already exposed one. So if we click on this, it goes blue. And now both of the scales are controlled by a single slider here, which is nice. So you can play with the size of these. Cool. And I think I want to turn the strength of this normal up a little bit. Nice. And do we even have height plugged in? We don't. So we'll plug in height for a second. And I'm just going to go to our material definitions for a moment and turn that height scale up a little bit, turn the tessellation up, just so we can see it a little bit better. Cool. Yeah, so like I said, I don't think this is half bad, and there's a lot of improvements, obviously. But we're going to hop up here now and think about blending these rocks on. We're going to touch all the albedo stuff later. We're going to assess that. Right now, it's the same as what I was saying earlier. Like, I want to really encourage people to think about this as like a material layering based approach, right? So we work on the grass and we know we have some rocks, and that's fine. We can layer the rocks on, but let's think about them as two completely separate things, right? I think much too often people look at a material and they just go, okay, I need to blend all these things together and like things crisscross the graph. And it is much better to have thing A, thing B, and then just where they get combined. And then after that, they're combined. You don't like end up pulling all the way across the and just creating a spider web, right? You want to work at it in stages. So I think these rocks make sense. This is not a bad way to start it, right? You start with these polygons. Slope blur makes a lot of sense. So that's what we want to do. And this is a scan just to get that initial shape. Makes sense to me. I think your slope blur, you're losing some samples here, right? Because you're slope blurring it a lot, which is fine. But here I can see the little layers, which may or may not be good, but let's just set the contrast at least to full. Because all we really care about here is getting these white shapes, essentially. And then we're doing a bunch of flood fills. And I understand what's going on here. And you're saying from what you understand, this is Roxana's notes, right? From what I understand, they're using a levels node to bring back the shape of the rocks. The main result to look at is the one from the blend. I don't know how to explain, play around with the levels to see. Makes sense. When you're learning designer, this is stuff that gets said a lot, right? You just play with stuff. I think I understand the point of what's going on here. They're just making a bevel of that initial like masks, right? To create some 3D-ness. And then they're blending over gradients on the min blending mode in order to create those kind of plane changes. I totally understand. I do think that this is a really confusing way to think about it, but it's not awful, right? Like I understand what's going on. I would probably do it slightly differently. So it's and when I say slight, it is slight. But let's just do it the way I would do it here. So you definitely do need a flood fill. Like there's no question. That makes sense to me. And then I do think you would want to bevel for those rocks. Right? So we do want to bevel these. And I'm tempted actually to bevel them full in and make an auto level. And then I just make a level here just to like basically flatten the tops of the rock. But what I like about doing it this way is I already have all these fun plane changes here. And if you want on that bevel, you can put on a little bit of smoothing. Maybe that's too much, something like this. I'm going to put a normal map node. Sometimes it's hard to see in the height map what you're looking at. So I'll just put these normal maps here, just so I can see how stuff is looking. So that makes sense to me. And then, yeah, you need a bunch of flood fills to cut those kind of gradients into it. So you can make a flood fill to random gradient. It's very similar to what's going on up top. It's just like slightly different approach. And you can apply, this just applies a gradient, right? To each. We've done a lot of videos on flood fill. I think it's the most popular video on the channel, actually. But this just applies UV coordinates to here. And then we can rotate these angles everywhere. Right? And then we'll just do a min blending mode. And what happens there is the darker the value, right? It's like the opposite of the max blending mode on the tile sampler. Only the darker of the two values will come through. So this was a lot brighter than the gradient that's going over top of it. So the gradient shows up. So it sort of like slices a section off that rock. If you want that slice to be more severe, yeah, you can play around like the levels of this gradient. Right? So if we pushed the black of that gradient up, we're going to get a much quicker cut. And if we push the white as well, that cut will just be a little sloped there. Right, so you can really kind of play with how you want that cut to work. And then I think it makes perfect sense to just make a couple of these and just randomly change the angle of the gradient. So again, I'm just pressing Control D to duplicate these three. And I'm going to the flood filter gradient and hitting this button to see to get a different random gradient. And if we chain all these together, we end up creating these little like sections essentially. And you can play with this a ton, right? Like you can go down to the bevel and or the level here and change how flat they should be, or there's a lot you can play with here. It also probably makes sense, I think, to grab another one of these. And on the last one, just do like a multiply. Because that'll create just, instead of a min blending mode, this will just slope the rocks in a certain direction. So it's very similar, right? There's not a ton different about this. The only thing that's really different is changing these to be a bit more subtle. And I'm being stronger with them, really. But there's a lot you can do to just play around with these. I think it's just more important to understand like what you're actually doing when you're making these. Right, so like I could have made these bevels way smoother, for instance. Right, or added a bit of a blur too. They're all just different ways of arriving at that kind of initial rock shape. I think this is fine. And you can even add more. Like there's no reason why you couldn't duplicate these again to add a couple more layers and put them in a chain and change the seed of this random gradient to get even more cuts. So we just have more cuts now in the final one. Lots of ways to do it. It's totally up to you. Right? And it's just simply a different look. Right? And then I do think over here this makes sense to try to warp these a little. So I actually think from here on it makes a ton of sense. Right? This directional warp is using a crystal just to kind of give them some more breakup. I think it's a little intense. So I'm going to slow it down a little. And if we just look at the normal map of what that looks like, we have these nice little rock shapes, which I think you can see the effect of that directional warp. It sort of creates these additional plane changes, which works real nice, right? I think that's really cool. And I think this guy's getting a little too crushed, so I might vary up some of the intensities of these. Cool. You could also, yeah, change the overall intensity of them a bit. Right, so right now, it's going to leave this big flat plane here because this is all white. But if I make this a bit darker, it's also going to cut there. So it's sort of like sculpting, but with the height information, really, right? And I think I'm going to get a different seed for that slope blur here. We'll go here. Just checking through these. I'm not crazy about how much more this one's shrinking. Right? So this is why, like I was saying, this method can work. I actually think, and we might do it actually, I think that only generating one pebble at a time is probably better in a separate graph. So I'm just going to grab all of this stuff, which is sort of just what makes our pebbles. And I'm going to right click and go create graph from selection. And we're going to call this rock generator. So you see we get this over here. It's getting mad at us because there's no output defined. So we'll just make an output node because this graph's whole job is just to put out a single rock texture. You'll see why I think this will help more. So I'm going to switch the polygon here to only have one. So we're going to make one pebble at a time. So this stuff all seems totally fine. Still makes sense. I do think we probably are going a little too intense. That's okay. We're just lowering the intensity of some of them by just changing that level. Cool. And because these are so much more zoomed out now, because we have one big pebble instead of 4 tiny ones, I'm going to go here and just make these noises a bit shorter or smaller as well. Particularly the crystal here, because it's getting really beat up. So I think it makes sense to zoom this one out a lot, like make it like 5 or something. And we'll build that normal if you want, just to be able to kind of better see that height map, which is just easier to see in a normal. But what's cool, right, is we can click this graph. So anywhere in the graph, empty space, we can seed it and get a completely new pebble. So we're not stuck with those 4 we have in the graph. We can make as many as we want, which is nice. So it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we're just putting out a pebble shape. And we definitely want to make sure that we auto level this first. Like that. And now what's cool is we can go back into our original graph we're working on, and we can go to our rock generator graph here and just click it and drag it out onto the sheet. And all this guy does, right, he is all of those 30 nodes. But he's going to replace all of this stuff. And what's cool is we can just grab as many rocks here as we like. Right, so I'm going to turn these all off. We can delete all of this. We can delete all of this because we did something slightly different. It makes this graph easier to look at. And if we ever want to make some improvements to this pebble generator, we just open up that other graph, make some adjustments, and everything in here will just update, which is really great. But we can look at these rocks that are being scattered around. And we can add more because it looks like Roxana has chosen 4 possible rocks, which I think is reasonable. So we can go here and just seed it and find another rock we like the shape of. Right, so this just gives us a bit more flexibility. I think that one's kind of cool. I need to get 2 more. Plug them into 3 and 4. So we'll get some even, maybe we can find a really interesting one. That's fun too. Although we kind of have stuff that look a lot like that one. So maybe we can find something a little, that's cool. I like that little, that's fun. That little like step there is cool. That's not bad either. And so this just spreads those rocks everywhere, which is really great. That are going to end up getting put in the grass, right? So I think at this point, what makes a lot of sense to do is, like, since it's so easy for us to make as many of these as we want, let's just set this to 6 and make 2 more. Right? Because we may as well, like earlier on, we were sort of limited by that 4, but because we can easily spit out as many rocks as we want now. I say, screw it, right? Let's just let's get a lot of variety out of this because it doesn't cost us anything. This is cool. I like this. Cool. So now this is spitting out these kind of interesting little rock shapes everywhere, which I think is really cool. You can get more variation out of this by, like I said, going into the tile sampler's symmetry random and rotation random up here. Oh, you turned them up. Good. So if she hadn't, this is good she did, right? But without this, this just will mirror some of them horizontally or vertically, right? That's why this is horizontal and vertical. And this will apply random 90-degree rotations to everything. So it just helps it feel like there's more than 6 types of rocks there because there's a lot more variety, which is really nice. So now that we sort of have our rocks and our grass done, let's talk about how to integrate them with each other, right? Because that's obviously really important. So I'll put this stuff up here because we are going to address this. Because what it is Roxana was trying to do a bunch of stuff here, right? This goes into the mass map input, mass map multiplier for the tile sampler to show the grass blades where there's only white. So you're hiding the grass blades where there are rocks. So both of these textures she's using to manipulate where the grass blades go or what they do so that the rocks can blend onto them correctly, right? Or in a certain way. So we have 2 layers, the rock, like the pebbles, the grass blades. And the question is, we want them to interact in sort of an interesting way. And how do we do that? So I understand what's going on here, but I do think we can think about that slightly differently, right? So for one, whenever I'm trying to blend 2 things over each other, so let's just make a frame of all of this. So I'll select it all, make a frame, and we'll just call this whole graph, or this whole frame rather, grass blades, just so that we know this is what this part of the graph does. It makes the grass blades. She was already doing it a little bit, right? The grass blade base, but I would make it even more explicit. So kind of nest them in each other. We'll put this one in all caps. Mardi Gras, put it in grass. And then here we'll just put the pebbles. Cool. And I like having them be transparent. It just helps me see it a bit better. Cool. So now there's a bunch of stuff over here. We'll address all of this stuff as we're going through the coloring, especially roughness, because this is the cardinal sin of roughness, I think, which is just take something and invert it. And like we're going to make our own roughness from scratch. So this is fine. Let's start blending stuff in with each other. So the first thing I like to do is I want to make sure when I'm blending 2 things in that I start with them being normalized, right? So what I mean by that is both the rock, the pebbles here, and the grass field are auto leveled so that there's full white and full black. I always want to start from there. So both both layers go from 0 to 1, and then we'll play with that. So the first thing to blend, I always just go, let's just try a max blending mode first and see what we think. Right, so the brighter of the 2 values will go over top of each other. So obviously this doesn't work great. The rocks are really small, and the grass blades are really bright. So they often, the rocks, we kind of want to sit on top of everything, right? So for one thing, I think the rocks could be bigger. I like the distribution of here. I think that all feels really nice. But I do think scaling them up a bit will help. Really see them better. Scale random makes sense for me too. A cool thing you can actually do with a tile sampler, which is really neat, is when you see stuff in nature, oftentimes you'll have like a big rock, and then beside the big rock, you'll have a handful of smaller rocks, and then around those rocks, a bunch of smaller rocks, and then like pebbles. So you get these kind of hierarchies, right? Where you have a big rock, and then it slowly falls apart into tiny rocks, and then another big rock, and it slowly falls apart into tiny rocks. It also helps avoid stuff like this. So we could turn the scale random off for a second, just so that they're all the same height. And to help illustrate this even more, let's lower how bright the grass is, because the grass shouldn't really be as tall as the rocks if the rocks are sitting on top of it. So we'll just create a level here, kind of a master level for our grass, and turn down the total height of the grass. And now you'll see the rocks are much more likely to sit on top of it, right? So right now the rocks are all about the same size. What we can do, I'm also going to go down and just see what Roxanne had on here. Position random makes sense. Rotation random also makes sense. She's turning some of them off, but let's leave them all on for now. What I like to do here is use a noise to control the size of the rocks. So it could be anything really, but I'm going to grab a cloud and maybe blur it a little. You know what, let's just use a Gaussian noise then. That's what I would kind of end up with anyway. And I'm going to plug this, I'm going to auto level it just to make sure that we have full white and full black. What's going to happen is the rocks that show up here are going to be much bigger, and the rocks that show up here are going to be much smaller. Right, so you'll see this. You plug it into the scale map multiplier, go down to size and turn the scale map multiplier slider up. And you'll see that the rocks that are in the white parts, they show up on the white parts of this Perlin noise, they stay quite large. And then as you move away to the darker areas of the texture, they get smaller. Why that's helpful is it helps to give you that kind of more natural feel where we have big rocks and then some small rocks and we just kind of get smaller and smaller, which is, I think, like a good, I think just generally that feels nice. And obviously, like, I'm trying to stick a little bit to Roxana's style here, but I can't help but inject some of my own. And also I'm just looking for, you know, examples that are interesting. So it's going to be slightly different at the end of the day, I guess is my point. But what we're going to do here, I like having this sort of hierarchy, right? Of big rocks slowly becoming smaller. We can exaggerate that by playing with the levels here on our scale map multiplier to give ourselves some more room. So you can see, right? If I play with the levels here, we can change how strong that effect is, right? Does it like really slowly drop off? Do they quickly drop off? There's a lot you can do here. But I do think this tends to make a more natural feeling result. The other thing we can do is I do think it makes sense to mask some of these out. Right, so add some mask random. We don't need them all. But this, I think, feels much more natural. Probably bring a couple back. The other thing we do is if we feel like too many of them are overlapping, like I said, there's other tricks for this too. But we can just play with that mask random more, right? And I think that's okay. Scale them up maybe a little bit more. I think that's fine. Yeah, I think that looks pretty cool. I'm very quickly... The other thing we should do is, theoretically, these smaller... Like, you could have random color here, right? You can turn on this color random. And this really just gives them random heights, right? Because the small... Like, the darker these are, the shorter they are. Now, the issue is sort of the fact that really the big rocks should be tall. Not necessarily, but they probably should be. So you can actually switch the color parametrization mode to scale. And what this does is the bigger the rocks are, the brighter they will be as we turn this slider up. So the smaller rocks get darker, which kind of makes sense because if they're a tiny little pebble, they shouldn't be this really tall but tiny pebble, right? If they're really small, like $1 or something, they should be pretty short. So turning this parametrize, very hard word, I'm trying my best, parametrization mode, did it. If we set that to scale and then play with that slider, we're just making the effect stronger, right? So you can see the big rocks stay quite bright and thus tall in the height map. And the tiny ones are darker and thus shorter in the height map, which I think is a more natural result here. It makes more like kind of intuitive sense. We probably want to put an auto level after these rocks, although we already have one, so that's good. Because you can see that even these ones got a little darker. So putting on that auto level just kind of brings them back. Make sure we have a white one and a black one. That's okay. It doesn't even need to be that strong necessarily. Or like we can go down here and say, hey, I love that effect, but let's turn it down a little bit, right? And you can still stack a little bit of color random on top. But I think this feels nice and natural. And you can massage this way more, and there's a lot more you can do with this to improve it. But this is a good starting point. And I'll be giving Roxana this graph when we're done, so she has a different jump off point. So there's this. And we're going to turn the height way up again on the material, just because I want to be able to see these rocks a bit better. So we go down to our height. Let's turn everything up a bit. Whenever this tessellation factor, depending on how strong your computer is, you can put this much higher too. But this looks pretty neat, I think. One thing I'd like to do is immediately just color these rocks a slightly different color. We're not going to get into any of the fancy texturing stuff yet, but I just want to make sure that we can see them as very easily separate, identifiable things. So whenever you extract, so we're doing what I said, right? We have thing A, which is the grass, thing B, which is our rocks. And what we want to do is just blend them together in one place, but we need to extract a mask. We did this a lot of my catacombs skull tutorial. The way I like to work is thing A, thing B, they're blended. Do I need any special masks from that blend? And you just kind of rinse and repeat that. That's a huge way I like to think about materials. So what we can do is grab our previous grass that did not have the stones and then subtract where we did have the stones. Let me flip the order of that. And if we histogram scan this, we're going to get a mask of where the stones are. And so you can see, like, obviously the grass is getting on top of them in some parts, which is okay. But this mask is really important because we're going to be able to use this to color the stones differently. So I'm actually going to make a portal node. So I'm going to drag a node off here and press Alt. And I can call this rock mask. And that just means that later on in the graph, so here's our kind of temporary albedo, I can make a dot and select that same mask, the rock mask, and use that to blend our rock color on. And I don't know what color Roxy had used. Okay, this is fine. I think they're up here for the most part, right? This looks like them. Yeah. So I'm just going to pick this color for now. And we'll turn that down. Oops. And we'll use this as our rock color temporarily. And we have our rock mask here. And that's just to blend the rock on here, just so we can see them a bit better. And you would almost certainly want to use another AO here after all the blades have been. There we go. So I'm using the height now instead of the AO to drive the blend between these colors. The issue is that the grass height map is quite low. So let's use the grass height before we level it. So I can make another portal here and call it grass height. The reason I use those portals is it's just nice to not have noodles blowing all over the graph. It's just confusing. There we go. So this actually feels a lot nicer than the AO, right? You can see the real difference here. This can feel kind of yucky. I feel like this is nicer, where the bottom of the blades is darker, the tops are brighter. It feels nice and soft. It feels kind of like a little fleshy, right? Like it's got like a little bit of a subsurface feel to it almost, which is nice. But we'll probably want to use the AO from the final height where the rocks are and everything to be able to darken. We want that contact between the rocks and the dirt. So for now, I'm just going to, in fact, for now, just for even make it really simple for albedo, let's take the AO and just multiply it on top, which gives us all of our nice contact shadows and stuff. And it's a little intense, so we can bring it down. I think this on vegetation textures, stuff like this, I think something people mistake is they put a lot of dark AO into the shadows. But if you have a piece of foliage, right, like the shadows don't tend to be super dark because ambient light will come through them because they're semi-transparent, really, right? Like, or not transparent, but translucent. It's like a subsurface look, right? If you hold a grass up or a blade of grass up to the sun, right, you see light come through the back, even though it's not being lit. So I think having that be less intense makes, even in here, I think you can feel that the grass blades feel more like vegetation. They feel a bit softer when you don't have really harsh shadows, right? So we can always make a different shadow on the rocks ultimately than what we have on the grass. That's totally fine. But let's leave it at that for now, because I think this already looks pretty nice. And I don't mind the tone of rock we did here. I think in the original it kind of wound up that way, and I like the kind of warm contrast against the grass. I think that feels nice. But I'm just going to turn the saturation down just a tad. So it was just feeling a little too red to me, like it looked a little like kind of fleshy. I think this feels nicer. I'm also just going to turn off all of this roughness. I think there's nothing wrong with what Roxy did. I think it's what a lot of people do when they're making roughness maps. They just take previous maps and just turn them into the roughness map instead of building it from scratch. I understand it. I did a lot of that too when I was starting. But I'm just going to put on like a flat roughness for now, just so it's not distracting. But I think this is working nice. We have, sure, there's some intersections in the grass blades, although it takes me a second to find one. And like I said, if you really want to, and we're going to do a big video on that on the Patreon, like on how to do a bunch of different advanced blending, we'll get there. But let's address now what Roxy was doing with these two textures to try to control the way in which the heights of the rocks and the pebbles were getting blended onto each other. I think that's important. So we don't really need... I see she's doing some stuff with the rocks up here, but we don't really need that yet. That's for other stuff. So I'm going to move these because we're not concerned with them yet. We're just working on the blending we've been doing down here is what we're worried about. Having a lot of fun. There's a lot of fun going through the patron stuff. It's always nice to see completely other approaches to how people make stuff. So this is cool. Like it. But let's work on that blending. So I actually don't even really think there's a ton of a problem here. I don't mind the way the grass blades sort of... This doesn't feel great, right? Because it cuts right through it. Like, that makes sense to me. And like this stuff doesn't feel great either. There's a lot of things you could do here. So I think what Roxy was doing at first was saying, hey, how about don't spawn any grass blades where there are rocks? So that's worth trying. So what you could do is go, let's grab a histogram scan of just where our rocks are, right? So these are the rocks. This is just where they are. We could go into our tile samplers and plug this into the mask map input. And now what this does is say, hey, where should grass be? And by default, it'll spawn them where the grass blade, where there's white on this input mask, and not spawn them in the black, which is not what we want. So if we go to the tile sampler here, and we set the mask map threshold to full, the blades are only growing right now where the rocks are. So it's the reverse of what we want. What we could do is go to this and on the tile sampler, and down on top of the mask map threshold, you can invert the mask. And so now they just don't grow where the rocks are. Now, it's sort of limited use because there's still grass blades growing around them. So there's a couple options we have here to make this feel better. It's also the case that we'll have to plug it into this one as well, right? So you would have to plug it into your second tile sampler as well. Go to the second tile sampler, turn its mask map threshold, my God, and turn on the invert. And so this probably is helping a little, but because the grass blades are so long, it doesn't really matter that we're just cutting them out in this little area because they're going to overlap. Now we could just make this mask bigger. We could expand this mask. So you could do that with something like a distance, right? So you plug this into the source in the mask and you just expand it. It's also possible to do it with something like a blur, right? So just blur this. But you know what? I think we're actually going to try doing the distance. I think it will work better. And you're seeing some gray value smearing here. So the distance node is just going to kind of expand those shapes. But you're seeing these things, and that's going to interfere with our mask map potentially. The reason you're seeing that is because this texture isn't fully white or black. We have some gray values here, right? So they're getting smeared. So you could use a node like a threshold. And this will just, on its default setting of 0.01, make sure everything is white. And this would allow us just to expand that range. So I'm just going to give ourselves some more room just so people that are following along can see. And we'll put this whole graph on Patreon so people can download it and look through what we did. Right, so if you're interested in just actually downloading it and pouring through it, that can help if you just want to follow along with it. So we do this, and we swap our mask maps to this. So right now they're plugged into this guy. You'll see me do this a lot. I'm just like holding shift on my keyboard, left clicking and rerouting this. So you can see this starts to work better, right? Because we're starting to just create a bigger distance for where you shouldn't spawn grass. So because these grass blades are so long, it's still not that helpful, right? Because sure, we're clearing a ton of space here, but the grass blades on this side are so long that they just fall over it, which may or may not be okay. It depends on what you're after, right? It really depends. But what we could do instead of getting rid of them is just make the grass blades shorter the closer they get to the rocks. That might also be an option. So we can still use this mask potentially, right? This can still work. But instead of plugging them into the mask map, let's disable these for now. And let's plug this into scale instead. So let's plug these into the scale map multiplier. And if you go down to scale and turn that on, they're going to shrink in the dark areas. So let's put the scale map multiplier to full. I'll put it to like 0.5 for now. I'll plug it into both. And put the scale map multiplier 0.5. So this is interesting. Now, the issue is we're scaling it in the wrong spot. Like we want these to get shorter here, not shorter out in the black. So this one we would have to invert. Right? We want them to stay fully sized out here in the grass area, but shrink the closer they get to the rocks. So this can also help. And the more we turn up the distance, the sooner they start shrinking. It's also probably the case that we don't want the grass blades to shrink in both Y and X. So right now, these grass blades that are out near the rocks, they're getting shorter and thinner, but we probably just want them to get shorter. So what you can do is go down to where we were doing the scale map multiplier, and you can see here you can change which ones it should affect. So right now it's doing X and Y, but we could just choose just X. So this is just them getting thinner, or just Y, which is just them getting shorter, but staying as wide. And I think this actually works better. We have a lot, I think this feels considerably better. And again, we can play with the distance here to determine like how strong that effect should be. Like how far away should you be before you start shrinking? Which is, I think, really effective. Similarly, we can also use this mask if we want to try to cut some of them out a little bit, right? So let's plug this back into mask map input as well. And now we're cutting away a ton of them. And that's because we had, this kind of looks cool. It's kind of interesting looking. But that's just because on the mask map input, remember we had inverted it. But now we're inverting it out here. So we'll need to go down to the mask map invert and set them to false. And we're going to want to play with this threshold for how strict we are about them going away. And because we want to control this on both tile samplers at once, this is also probably something we want to control outside of the graph. So I'm going to expose this. Then that name is actually probably okay, but we'll call it grass mask map threshold. And on the tile sampler, the second one, also link those together. And now I think we're actually starting to get somewhere. We need to invert this one as well. You can see we're creating these little areas where these smaller blades of grass, and there aren't as many of them, exactly where we're trying to put these rocks, which is really helpful, right? It makes a big difference with the blending. And there's still more we can do here. But I think this is like a great start, right? So I'd like to keep this to under 2 hours, but buckle up. I think we're going to be here a while, but I think it's worth it. There's a lot of fun stuff to do in here. Still, I'm having a lot of ideas about what we could do. So we have a lot helping us there, right? So in summary, we took where our rocks are, we threshold them just to make sure they're white and black. We have this distance that's just controlling, hey, when should these start getting shorter, right? So the darker this texture is, the shorter they'll get. So they're still quite long out in the middle when they're really far away from the rocks. But the closer they get to the rocks, the more they start shrinking, which helps us blend them better. Outside of that, we're also saying at a certain point along this gradient, you should just stop being there at all, which helps us get rid of some grass blades that may be problematic that are close to it, right? Which helps. The other thing that I saw Roxy doing was using the rotation map to try to, I think, rotate the blades so that they point away from the rock, which is another really good idea. I think that makes a lot of sense too. The problem with using, and that's what this note was about. She was making a little area and saying, plug this into the rotation of the grass blades. The problem though, remember, is that this isn't going to rotate them away from the rock. What it's going to do is say, hey, I'm going to, if it's a black area, I'm going to rotate less. And if it's white, I'm going to rotate more. So if you use this mask, all of the blades closest to the rocks would just point straight up. They wouldn't rotate. And out here in the middle, they would just start to rotate clockwise. That's it. I think what we want is them to have their kind of wavy rotation out here in the field. But the closer they get to the rock, the more they should try to rotate away from the direction of those rocks. So if you have a rock in the middle, they should be like spokes of a bike away from the rock. For that, you're actually looking at using a vector map, not a rotation map. So let's quickly explain what that does. I'm going to do another tile sampler down here, and I'm going to grab a shape and just make a quick arrow, just so that we all are able to see how the vector map is going to work. So we take our gradient linear 2, and I'm just going to directionally warp this up, and this is just to make like a quick little arrow, or at least a shape pointing at a chevron, I guess, something pointing in one direction. Okay. If we plug this in, and we display this shape using our tile sampler, I'm going to make way less of them. We don't need a ton. So the rotation map, like we did earlier, it's just going to apply those rotations, clockwise rotations, the brighter this map is. So we use the ordinary rotation map, and we plug this up, and we turn the rotation map up. The chevrons down here at the bottom move very little, where it's darker, and these move much more where it's brighter. But we want them to move in a specific direction. So what we do here is we make a vector map. Often what you're doing is just plugging in a normal map, but just to show how this works, you can imagine it as a color instead of a grayscale. So you won't use the rotation map, instead we're going to use the vector map. And essentially what happens is, imagine you have a value in the red channel of the color, so black to red, and a value in the green channel, black to green. Often it's a normal map, right? But if we go down to the rotation now and turn the vector map multiplier up, you'll see they're all moving in a specific direction as indicated by the combination of these colors. So if we put both to black, you see that they're all pointing down into the bottom left corner towards 0, 0. If they're both white, they're going to point the opposite to the top right. If one is black as one is white, they're pointing down here to 0, 1, or to 1, 0 rather. And if we invert this, they'll point up to the top left. So it's just using a color to tell it where it should go, right? It is important to understand how this works for other more complicated stuff, and we're going to do a whole video on vectors and figuring out how to do vector warp and vector morph properly in the vector map multiplier, vector map input rather. But for now, a normal map of our rock textures is going to work really well, because it basically does all of those color picking for you. So if we just blur this, and I'm going to make sure we auto level it as well, and we turn this into a normal, this is going to basically get the job done for us. This will work really well. So I'll put this up to like 20 or something. There's no magic number there. I'm just making a really strong normal so I can see it more than anything. You could just change the strength of the rotation map input on the tile sampler if it were too weak. I just like having it nice and visible, but there is no magic number about 20. I'm seeing a lot of people making tutorial stuff where they say like, hey, you put in 0.03, then I put in a slope blur that's 0.1. Like you're never going to catch me doing that really. I don't really believe in those magic numbers. I think it's just the case that they all do different things, and you should just understand what a low number means there or what a high number means there, and you'll just know what to pick, right? You should never follow along with me number by number unless you're very new, because I don't think it's giving you the whole kind of full story about what you should be doing, right? So we'll plug this into the vector map multiplier. And what you'll see is if we go down here and turn that one up, right, the vector map multiplier under the rotation tab, you'll see that the blades start moving away from the rocks. They start positioning themselves away, which works really, really, really well. We want it to work on this one as well. So we'll go here and we'll into the second tile sampler and turn its vector map multiplier up too. And now you can see that all the grass blades just sort of flee from those boulders. And really the strength of this blur is going to control when those start to happen. And I think that works pretty well. And I'm actually saying like we have the mask map input on these, turning some off here. And actually think that now that we have the vector map controlling it, we could probably turn that number down. So if you remember down here, we exposed the threshold on both of the tile samplers. So I'm going to go up here where we exposed it, right? So clicking anywhere in the empty graph and going up to the input parameters. And I actually think it's worth turning this lower, maybe even off, just slightly. And I think that does a really good job of making the grass blades interact more appropriately with the boulders, which, like I said, I believe is what Roxy was trying to accomplish in the first place. So this is nice, and I think we get some nice, we still avoid a lot of the weird intersections, and I think it works pretty well. We can still do some other stuff here to make this even better. For one thing, we probably want to fill in this gap where we do have no blades. So what I'm going to do is duplicate a third one here. And before we do that, actually, just thinking about the order, to get rid of some of these intersections, but we're doing a bunch of it here on these blades, which is fine. But to get rid of some more with the rocks, because in some places a blade will like cross over a rock. Like that's not the worst, right? But it's still not great how this feels. A good trick here is we could actually switch this max blending mode to have, basically we want some of these blades to actually like come up over top of the rock. There's a couple ways you could do this. The easiest way is to probably blur where the rocks are slightly and add them to the grass. So this is just going to make the blades taller when they get on top of a rock. Now we don't want that rock there. So we could take a histogram scan of our grass blades just to get a mask of where they are and where they aren't. Right? So we're only adding on to the blade. So see how this blade is getting a lot taller where it will eventually go over top of the rock. So that can help. And then we would need to swap this blend because we've made some adjustments. You can see how the grass blades now come up on top of the rock, which is fine, right? They get a little softer and they spread on top. The issue is our blend here doesn't know about that. And that's because when we're extracting that rock mask, we're subtracting this from before that grass blade got made brighter. So we just need to swap these and then it'll work. So now those grass blades actually like pop up on top of the rock if they ever happen to go on top. And you can control, so over here you get a bunch of it. Right, like this stuff. Before that worked quite differently. And you don't have to add it on full strength necessarily. Right, it can be like very light. But that does help some of those intersections and helps those blades kind of crawl up on top of the rocks where they need to. Like here's a good example, right? If we turn that off, we get the crashing. But if we do this, they can actually come up on top of it a bit. And that helps take care of some of that intersection, which I think feels good. You can move that up a bit more if you want to. And that can help just create some of that, additional intersection blending that feels good. I also think I just want to fill in these dark areas where there are no blades with blades to actually get some. So to do that, I'm just going to duplicate one of our tile samplers. And on this one, I'm actually not worried about any of the scale map multiplier. I'm not worried about any of the rotation map. Well, rotation map multiplier is fine, but not the vector map. I'm not worried about the mask map threshold. I don't want to turn any of these ones off. So we can unplug the mask map and the vector map and the scale map and the rotation, or the scale map. We want it the rotation map still. But this is just to create like a lower layer of blades just to fill in any gaps. So I'm going to make these blades a lot more of them. So they're a bit smaller too. And I'm going to go to where our final blades are blended which is right here. And I'm just going to blend these in on a really low intensity. So I'll set this to max, but we'll lower the height of these blades a lot, right? By bringing the white level in. It's just to fill in that empty space so that you get the impression that there's like other layers of grass back there, right? And it's really subtle. It's just to fill in those empty spaces. It just makes it feel more complete in those areas where we weren't having blades properly. But I think that works pretty well. And you can always turn the strength of the vector rotation down a bit, right? So this is the strength of how much they flee from the rocks. It doesn't have to be on 1. So we could expose this one again, right? We'll just call it, well, let's cancel this. Let's make sure we name these correctly, because we named the first one we exposed to both. I was going to call it blade, but we should call it grass vector rotation because this one's already called grass. We just want to keep that consistent. So we'll go down to our rotation, to our vector rotation. We'll expose this and we'll call it grass vector map multiplier. And we'll link the other tile sampler to that as well. So we'll go to rotation and call this one as well the rotation vector map multiplier. So we can, if we want, click anywhere on the graph, go to the input parameters, and tune this if we don't like how strong that effect is. So it's probably a happy medium somewhere. But I think that looks pretty cool. It kind of nests them in tightly. And I think it's the look that Roxy was essentially going for there. So I like this. I think this works fairly well. And I think that's got us basically sorted for the height map. There's a lot more you could add, right? We could add a lot more rocks. And at any point, because it's substance, what's so great about it is we can change this stuff, right? Like there's no reason why we couldn't scale this up. Right? If we decided, hey, you know what? I want the boulders to be bigger actually. And everything will just kind of update as we go. But let's walk through the color and the roughness. I think we got some pretty good improvements on here, right? So we have our kind of our under layer of grass, our 2 layers of grass for blending together just to avoid some intersections. And I actually think we're going to turn off this screening we added on. I don't think we need it. We're going to make some adjustments later. And at the end of the day, we have our grass with all of our rotations, spreading away from the rocks, all that stuff. We're making them a lot darker there. And then here's where we're doing all of our blending. So here we were preparing our grass by making them taller when they happen to go over top of a rock, so we have less intersections. And here's where we actually all blend them together and make our masks and stuff like that. So we can make a little frame on this and call it like height map blending or something. Cool. Makes sense to me. And we have our albedo is really, really simple right now. But I'm going to look through all of what Roxy been doing. We can just talk about some of the stuff and incorporate that into how we're going to work on our albedo together. So took the rock mask. And this is to get color variation for the rock. So I think part of the problem with this is it's not specific to where the rocks actually are, right? So if the goal here is to have the rocks all be a slightly different color, the problem is the rock might not be in the right spot, right? Because it's just based on, unless something was plugged in here that I accidentally deleted, but I don't think I did. Yeah, like there's no guarantee that these overlap with where a rock is. In fact, they might cut a rock in half, right? And be a different color in kind of a random place. The other thing I'm not crazy about here is that there's all this stuff going on to the whole texture sheet, including the grass. And you have to be constantly avoiding the grass by masking it out wherever you need it to, right? Which I would, in the same way that we built the grass height map and then the rock height map, I want to make the grass albedo and the rock albedo as separate things and then blend them together. I don't want to like constantly have them going back and forth. I don't think that's ever the best way to do it, really. I'm just going to turn our tessellation stuff back on. I would much rather just make sure that the vegetation is textured, or the grass, I suppose, and then texture our rocks and go from there. So let's do it in that order, because I understand the point. Right here, we're just trying to get a gradient map to color the rocks. Here's some, like just here, right? This rock just kind of changes color halfway through. So we can, and I get this, you want some color variation per blade, but let's just talk about what you want. You have this, I think this is sort of just brightening up the edges. That's fine. We want to make the edges of the blades a little brighter. I don't like to do it on vegetation a ton because I think it tends to make it feel more like stone and kind of edge damagey, where the grass shouldn't really have edge damage. It should be pretty similar. But we can go through that. Here's some color variation per blade, and that's where there's this cool trick. We can address that. And then it's putting the rocks on. There's some AO involved, some color breakup here on the rock. And then this is just some, I think this is just making the texture more blue, basically. The whole texture more blue. And then making the whole texture a little bit more orange in the shadows, it looks like. Right? Or no, it's making it more blue because you're subtracting orange. You're getting rid of the orange that's in the shadows. So I could get that. So you want a cool shadow, warm highlight probably. So I follow you. That makes sense to me. Let's build them, though, in one layer, right? So we're going to build the grass color first, and then the rock color, then blend them together, right? Same thing we did the height. You always want to think in layers, not anytime you can avoid all that kind of cross contamination, usually the better. So this is honestly not even that bad, right? Like the grass in the deep parts is more blue, it's more in shadow. So if there's a sun out and it's a clear sky, you're getting like cooler shadows. And it's a bit warmer towards the tips where it's thinner and the light sees it, and you're getting some transference of warm light through the thin membrane. Again, hold that leaf or blade of grass up to the sun, you get that kind of warm light coming through. If you want to have some per blade color variation, the trick thing, I understand the point. And yeah, you could do this. All that's really happening here is it's just taking a cell, slope blurring it, and then warping it by the height map. The problem with that, to my mind, is you just get a bunch of kind of jaggy aliased stuff, and it's quite random in the sense that it's pretty uncontrollable. Like you're picking these colors, which is nice, right? At least you get to pick the gradient map you want. There's a couple things I'm not crazy about here, but we could try layering it on, right? Just to see what we think. So here, I would just put it on like a soft light or something and have it be on quite a low intensity. So this just adds some breakup, and this could be okay. The thing I'm not crazy about is it tends to jump blades a little. Right, like we have this really yellow area here. It's okay. If I were going to use it, I would want it on very low intensity, really low. But if we just want some color variation per blade, something else I'm not crazy about right now, I actually don't know if I like how strong the trough in the center of these blades are. And that's just a personal thing. It has nothing to do with what you should or shouldn't do, but I'm going to personally tone that down just a bit. I'm actually tempted to have it do the reverse, like to not dig in, but to punch out. So I'm actually going to see, like I almost prefer the reverse, where it's tented at the top and not pushed in. I kind of like this better. But this is purely a personal preference thing. Right, however you want to do this, there's nothing wrong with whatever approach you want. And I could go either way, I think. Like, maybe a little bit of subtract is okay. I guess I like them being a little flatter. Yeah. No, that's okay. Just dial it back a little. I just think it's too strong. Cool. Time spent rotating around the material, 8 hours. Time spent building the material, 20 minutes. Sort of a classic material art thing. So we could leave this on a little low opacity, sure, right? And we'll put that close to the end. If we wanted to have per blade color variation, we could probably make a flood fill of this. So we have a height map of our final grass blades, right? We put it in a little portal here. So we could just go here, make a dot node, grass height, and I suspect we can actually get a flood fill out of this. So I'm going to make a normal. I'm using a Sobel normal. I just tend to. In fact, I might replace the last one. To me, it's just a different way of making the normal map. Different algorithm. I like it because it tends to be a little bit less crunchy for me. And for me, part of the reason, like I'll often, if I'm making a more kind of photoreal-y crunchy material, I use the normal node. But if I'm making something a bit more chill, I tend to use Sobel. If you're trying, if you want it to look a bit more stylized or whatever, like I like the look of this better. You can see them next to each other. It's not a totally fair comparison because their strengths are not exactly the same, but you can see the difference. The Sobel filter or the non-Sobel filter just tends to be a bit crunchier, right? So I prefer that. But that's a preference thing. Like I said, like I can't help but like have some of my just kind of tastes and stuff leak into this. So that's not a bad or good thing. It's just a choice. So I'm going to use a Sobel filter here, and I'm going to make a curvature from that. And I'm fairly confident that if we histogram scan this, we can get a reasonable flood fill where we have an island per every blade of grass. Or close enough that it won't matter. You can turn the normal map strength up a bunch just to make this easier to get. So let's see what that flood fill looks like. It might not be particularly close. Yeah. So let's go to the flood fill and have a bit more strictness. And that's getting better. But they are bleeding into each other quite a bit. Really, the most it should be is this. And that's not bad, actually. That's not awful. So if we go flood filter random grayscale here, theoretically, we're getting a random grayscale per blade of grass. If you wanted to have a bit of extra insurance that these, like this is closing up, for instance, because you need separate islands in the flood fill. We've done a lot of flood fill stuff on the channel. You can blur this a little and then histogram scan it again to try to close up some of those gaps. Like that might work better. Yeah, I suspect this will actually be better at the end of the day. So this just gives us a random grayscale value per leaf, or just about per grass blade. There might be a little bit of overlap there, but that's okay. And we have all this black lines in between all that random grayscale, which we'll want to close. So remember, whenever you're doing that, whatever flood fill you're doing goes into the source of a distance, and whatever went into the flood fill node, that mask, should go into the mask of the distance. And this should give it, I mean, even if it's not perfect, so we could preview it by just putting it into a gradient map and just setting it to like add sub. I'm not going to do this ultimately. I just want to see how close it does follow the blades. So not particularly, although, I mean, it technically does. But we could probably play with this a bit more. Play with the scan a little. Oh no, that one we do. It's this one we want to probably be a bit less careful with. It's pretty tricky to do with stuff that's this tight together. I think we can get pretty close. It's fine. Blur it just a tiny bit. Yeah, and I think this will just give us some color breakup per blade, which is nice. Yeah, I actually think that's worth it. Adds a little bit of color variation. I also think this is a better texture to use as our directional warp. Instead of the height map of the grass, I think it works better to use this texture because that'll get rid of some of that aliasing. Like, see that we have much less. See how previously we had all this kind of like gradient map aliasing. If we swap this height map as our intensity away, instead use this grayscale, random grayscale, that we get less of that warping. Like, I think this actually feels better now. But I don't mind the trick. I just think we want to have that be quite low intensity because really the blades shouldn't change color that much. So I actually think that's okay. This is pretty subtle here. The blades of grass shouldn't really be like wildly different colors right next to each other. Now, to make these feel a bit more coherent with each other, we're going to have an AO at the end of it. But you could make like something like a curvature smooth. We already have our normal map up here. And we can use this curvature to brighten up the edges just a little bit. So I'm actually going to just take an HSL of this color, make it brighter, make it a bit more saturated, and maybe push it towards yellow. So the idea here is we're going to have try to imitate more of that subsurface on the edges, which our curvature map, particularly the convexity, does a good job of giving us. Right, so right now the blade edges are getting this slightly more yellow highlight. And if we don't like how low down that goes, we can also mask you can use the height map as well. Right? And multiply it so that the effect is weaker on the bottom of the blades. Right, because right now they get pretty bright down there. We can make that weaker, right? Because the height map is darker at the bottom. And we can even push it more, like push the blacks up more, so that this effect really only takes place on the tops of the blades, which I think looks nice. Like we want it to be fairly subtle, right? We don't want to hit people over the head with this one. And I still think we could even push this even more yellow, even more saturated. I almost rather, whenever I'm doing a blending color like this, I'd rather have this be nuts, like have it be much more than I think I need, and then dial back its strength on the blend node itself. But I think this is honestly probably all you need for the grass, really. Like, it's a pretty simple thing. The rocks are a bit more interesting. And really, because we can delete all this stuff now, the old stuff, because we've already gone through it. Because we're already putting this mask down here to plug the rocks on, we can just do the rocks as their own separate material, like I had mentioned. So we'll call this our grass albedo. And then here we can do a bit of texturing on our rocks. So I know we had that kind of variety of different hues and tones per rock. That's pretty easy for us to do. We just need a flood fill of the different rocks. And we already have. So we just make a note here and we call this rocks. Right, so again, I just click this, press Alt to make a dot node, and then write the name of the portal I want. And that's just so I don't need to have the noodle stretching everywhere. Make another knot here, another dot here. We're not making wood. Later though, soon, next month. We pick the rocks, and we do a histogram, or the better thing to do here is make a normal, because we're going to make a flood fill here. And make a flood fill to, we make a curvature. And if we histogram scan this, we can get each of them as their own little island. And this works great into a flood fill. Right, so each of these rocks gets their own little ID. The reason why I wanted to do it with a curvature is it's hard to, we can't really histogram scan this and use this as a flood fill. Because the rocks touch, if we had used this as a flood fill, these guys would get the same island. But because we turned it into a normal and we got the curvature, right, where they're the most concave, we're able to isolate that to keep the rocks separate cells. Right, so that's a really good trick to keep in your kind of in your tool bag there. And what we could do here is very much the same. If we just go to a flood fill to random grayscale, and remember, every time you do this, you want to make a distance node, plug it into source, plug the mask into mask, set this to full, and we can use this to kind of pick our different rock tones that we want. You can even, if you want to be cheap about it, just add sub this, so some rocks get brighter, some get darker, right? And since we're already doing all the math with the masks down here, it doesn't really matter that, like, we can just be happy up here texturing the rocks and not worry about them falling onto the grass, right? Whereas earlier in the graph before that Roxana had, there was a lot of like doing a thing to the rock, now making sure it got masked out of the grass, and then doing a thing to the grass, but making sure the rock got masked out. That's why I think it's much easier to be like, here's our grass stuff, here's our rock stuff, and just in one spot over here, they just get blended on, and then we're done. We don't have to think about it. So this is like fine just to have a little bit of tonal breakup, right? So some stones are a bit darker, some are a bit brighter, but it's really subtle, right? Doesn't add a ton. We probably also want to specify colors. So I'm going to make a duplicate of the random grayscale here and get a different seed of it. And here we can pick some different rock colors we like. So the way I usually want to do something like this is open up our gradient map, pick the original color. So you'll see me, all I'm doing is picking all three of these to be the original brown. And then I'm clicking on one of them and I'm just gonna be like, how about this is a little darker, a little bit more saturated, maybe a little bit more blue. Because the idea is I want them all to be sort of related to that main color. Maybe this one's a bit brighter, a little bit less saturated, maybe a bit more green, so a bit more yellow. Right, and you can see when we blend these on, we're just getting slightly different tones of rock. And at least, like, what people will often do is go to the gradient map and just like run it crazily all over a reference or something. And I find that that can make it just a little too messy. And they end up not being like related to each other, if that makes sense, right? They're just kind of random. I prefer to go in here and like choose some specific colors I like, as if you were painting, right? Maybe we could have like a bit of a brighter one that's really low saturation. And I'm just trying to create a nice selection of kind of tones of rock here that I like. And that's too pink for sure. So we'll take some blue out. And I'm just picking some colors that are kind of all in the same relative family. And you can tone that intensity down, right? This is just to give them a little bit of a different tone. And I think that works pretty nice. I think it's okay. If we wanted to add some kind of more medium color changes, like the rocks don't have a ton of detail to them, and that's fine. That's the graph. We could always add more detail if you wanted to, which would be really easy, right? You would just add it up here. Like you could just take, if you wanted a bit of breakup on this, you could take this right? Because this is before it gets blended onto the height map here. So you could take something like, even something simple right now, like a moisture noise, and subtract it, or even overlay it, just to get a bit more detail onto them. But that's also a style choice, right? Like maybe you don't want that on the rocks. You don't want any like high frequency noise potentially, right? It's totally up to the look you're going for. So I'm just kind of toning down that noise a little bit. You can see all the grass blades are still updating and all that fun stuff. But this is just trying to put a little bit of surface detail onto them. Just a tiny bit. Just they have a little bit of tooth to them. But that's, again, this is, like I said, this is totally a personal preference thing. People are going to have really different kind of wants and desires from that. So we're just going to add a little bit of noise and call that a day, because who knows what people want to do. I just wanted a little bit of stuff on there. One thing I might do is just break these up a bit. So what I'm going to do is just take like a cells 1 and subtract them from our rocks. Now they're going to get really small because we're subtracting so much. So you could set this to, you could go like invert this and set it to add sub. And I'm just trying to add a bit of a plane change to them. So you'll see what they look like. They have just more plane changes now. And I'll just make sure that after this, we're auto leveling it because they are getting a little too short. We want to bring them back. But that just adds a little bit more surface. That's what this is. Right? If I turn this off, you'll see. This just adds a little bit more variation to the rock surfaces, which I think is nice. Cool. I think we got to make sure that this is all still working well. I just noticed some of the grass is still kind of penetrating there, so I'm just adding a bit more so that they come up nice and tall on top of those blades, on top of those rocks. Yeah. That's fine. In fact, maybe we're okay with them not being so... the grass, they're pretty tall now. The rocks, I mean, are pretty tall. So maybe we don't actually need a ton. Yeah. That looks good. Cool. Could even blur these a bit more. Cool. Yeah, I just want a little sidebar there just to get a bit more detail onto them. But you could take this as far as you want as well. So we could take something like a moisture noise and run it through that same gradient map of colors we picked, just to get some breakup, and do the same thing where we just go, hey, you come here, go to a soft light, probably dial that back a little, maybe take that same moisture noise and rotate it a little bit, and put a gradient map there, and do an add sub. And that's just to make some areas of it brighter or darker. We could even use like something like a black and white spots just to get a bit more detail onto it. Something like black and white spots too. And you could really texture these forever. I just want to get some basic noise on them. And again, it's really a style thing. If you wanted to add a bit of curvature to these, that also makes a ton of sense to me. And it's kind of part of that look. So we could, by the same token, just make a curvature smooth. Pull this over. And we could even just scan this to get just the most convex areas of our rock. And I'll actually just add these on top. So using a gradient map to turn this into color information, putting this on, setting it to add. I just want to brighten up the edges of the stone. And obviously this is really intense, so I'll tone this down a lot. Another thing you can do, well, we probably need that to be even weaker. These are pretty subtle. That actually feels pretty good. I don't mind that. Yeah, I think the stones are probably a little bright. So I'm also just going to make a level here and just darken them a bit. So the stones have a bit more of a dark, it's probably too much. Something like that. Yeah, that's nice. Cool. I think that works. So let's say that's it for the rocks, really. Because again, this is a really good jump off point. There's a lot of texturing you can continue to do here. So I'll make a frame on this and we'll call this rock height or rock color. And really that AO here just helps us to consolidate them because they're pretty flat here, which is okay on a base color really. But that AO helps us just kind of lock everything in. And right now we're still just taking our AO and multiplying it, which isn't great. And we might want a different AO on the rock potentially, right? So there's nothing stopping us from going, okay, give me that final height map over here, right? Turn this into a AO that's specific to the rocks. And maybe the rocks here, we just get a version of our rocks that's a bit darker, maybe a little bit more saturated and a bit more blue. So I'm actually going to use a level to make it a bit more blue. So I'll just go to the blue channel and pump up the blues. And I'll use my AO as a mask here to just put some blue onto the bottoms of the rock. So we get these kind of cooler tones on the rock. And then I might actually do the same thing with our final AO. Instead of just multiplying it on top of everything, I'm probably just going to take a HSL of everything, get some darker value that's more saturated. And same thing, I want to push everything here more blue, which is what Roxanne had been doing when she took the orange and subtracted it from her base color at the end, which was her removing orange. But I'm going to do the same thing, but this time just add blue. So I'll go to the blue channel in a level and pump up the amount of blue to get this kind of nice, I love this kind of like really saturated dark blue. It's like a phthalo blue. Use that. And the same thing, we'll use the AO here now as a mask. To say, hey, put some more blue into the shadow between all these blades. And I think that can be really effective. And we can probably still make this a lot darker as well. But I think that can work really, really nice. Doing the roughness quick, what I don't like seeing people do is go, well, I'll just turn my height map into a roughness, right? Which doesn't make a ton of sense because it's not like where the height map is low, it should get wetter or smoother. Where the height map's tall, it should get rougher. Not necessarily, right? So, and that's what's going on here. It was just like a curvature and then leveled it. Like, you need to do a bit more work, I think. So let's just start with some flat colors. Let's say the grass should be a little smooth, but not crazy. I'm also going to make sure I set my roughnesses here to 16-bit. So go up to the output format and go to 16-bit per channel, not 8. So like that. I want it to be a little smooth. Sometimes those blades have that kind of waxy look to them, right? And then what we could do is grab some stuff from textures we've already done. So this would be a helpful texture we can use. Or for instance, like this would be great. That kind of randomness we used. So you could put this in and just set this to add sub. And this will just make some blades a little bit rougher than others, right? Just to add some simple breakup to your roughness. And then we could even do something like take a like white noise. I'm almost tempted to do. Like if you were to take a white noise and slope blur it by the final height, or at least the grass height, and you set this to really high samples in min. White noise might not be the best, but like a black and white spot 3 or 2 might work. I'm just looking for kind of some spottiness. And the hope is, yeah, exactly. We kind of spread them and get these kind of stretches up and down the blade. Again, we're just looking for an interesting noise, essentially, where there's some breakup per blade. I think this will actually work pretty well. And if you wanted it to be even more noisy, you could turn this into a normal and then turn it into like just a normal curvature. So we get this kind of spotty noise going up and down the blades. This is just to add some like striations along it, so that there's some roughness breakup on the blades themselves. You can see them there. I might actually do a little bit of both. So we'll do this. We'll have that one, but we'll also do that initial noise. Like this. I think that works pretty well. I don't think you need to make these that complicated. Especially the vegetation. If you look at like scan data vegetation, it's usually pretty consistent unless there's like dead grass. Some of the blades are dead or parts of the blade are dead. That can definitely change it. Or if the base of the soil is wet, so the bottoms are a bit more smooth. But usually on the actual blade itself, it's pretty consistent. And I don't think anything, I think like something like this works pretty well. And then we just make the same thing, but for the rocks. So I feel like the rocks will be a lot more rough. So this is our grass. This is our grass roughness. And down here, we're going to do our rock. Making some more room. We're going to do our rock roughness. Now remember, we already have the mask to blend between these. Right? We built our rock mask already when we extracted it over here. We can just do this. And now we have automatically our rocks are a lot rougher because they're much brighter. But if we want to texture these, we have a lot of fun stuff up here we could use. So if I want to send a bunch of stuff down to the roughness, a thing I like to do is just get an RGBA merge node. So this lets me plug in a bunch of different channels. So maybe we could use that random grayscale. We can use that moisture noise that we already used. That black and white spots would be nice. The curvature we built, if we wanted to, that could help a lot as well. So this gives us a bunch of textures to use. And if we are going to use this flood fill though, we want to make sure that we also don't use these quadrants. So I'm also going to, just to be safe, histogram scan where our rocks are and multiply it over top. Or more importantly, the smarter thing to do here is to make a middle gray. Just move this out of the way. We can prep that over here. And use this as the mask of where the middle gray should go. So we have our random grayscale. Or our flood fill broke, because when we added all of that noise. So we just need to go and adjust this slightly. In fact, we might want to just grab a version of that normal before we added the noise. So it's actually this guy. Yeah, so sometimes it's easier to actually grab a flood fill before the surface noise went on, so you don't have to deal with that. The reason I want to do this is I just want that gray background. That's right. There's our rock. Cool. And we'll send this over. But once we have these textures, I'll make a portal node and call this roughness masks. And then I can pull them down here where we're doing our rock texturing. So go to our rock masks, or sorry, to our roughness masks. And we can use an RGBA split. And then we have all these things to work on our rock with. So if we just add sub these random grayscale, that means we can make some rocks a little smoother than others, some a little rougher, just to add a bit of breakup. And I'm probably going to add sub a lot of these, that moisture noise we used. And again, we're going very quick here because I just want to keep the video to under 2 hours if possible. But this is just a good jump off point. You would want to do a lot more work. We have a bunch of videos like on the Patreon. There's, big 6 or 8 hour tutorials where we really go through this with like a ton of detail. Especially roughness. I think it's something that's not practiced enough, really. So you can head over there to check that stuff out and to get this graph, right? So I think that's worth checking out. And then I think where we have the tips of our rock, we want it to get much smoother or much rougher. So I'm actually just going to add those right on top. And that's just because I want them to be pretty matte when they hit the top of the rock. So this is not a bad roughness map. It's a little bit more purposeful. It's not as random as it was before. And then we can finish this with probably an AO here. So we can grab our final height, make an AO here. And you have options here. So if you were to like multiply this, you're basically saying that the field these are on is wet. Right? Because if I multiply this and it gets darker in the roughness map there, you're making it smoother. So it's like a wet ground. But what I prefer to do is just matte it out more. So I would actually invert this and screen this on. And just make it so that's rougher in the cracks. I prefer that. Just to kind of matte those out a bit more. But I think this works really well. I think we made some improvements there. And I think the end result is quite nice, actually. Like I said, there's more. Ordinarily, you want more time for the roughness and for the color, add more variation. But I really wanted to spend a lot of the time just thinking about how the graph was organized to begin with and how to kind of structure some of those ideas. But this is definitely a very good jump off point for going further with this Roxana. All right, well, I had a ton of fun with this one. This was really, really cool. I think if I'm ever getting stuck, I wanted to keep this video to under 2 hours, and that just was not going to happen. At some point, I looked over at the clock and was like, there's no way, but I was just getting so sucked in. And whenever you're in a point, right, where you're just feeling time just slip away like that, usually means you're having a pretty good time. So this was really fun, and I hope people found it useful somewhere. I can definitely check in with Roxana to see if that was helpful and just get some feedback from her. Like I said in the intro, this is something I'm going to be trying to do a lot more of, getting patron work, people submitting problems, and actually turning them into videos on the channel where we can actually go through it all together, and hopefully we all learn stuff together. If you like the video, please like the video. If you'd like to subscribe, that's even better. And if you want to be super helpful, you can head over to Patreon if you'd like to support me being able to continue making this kind of thing. It's also a way to be able to get, if you run into problems, you can send me a DM. We might be able to set up this. I'm also working towards getting a Discord set up to help facilitate that as well. That'll be happening very shortly. So please like the video if you can, subscribe if you are able, hit the notification bell in particular is really helpful. And then massively appreciated is heading over to Patreon, at least checking it out, seeing what you think. If you have some, like I said, if you have something that you thought would be a good idea to go through in the channel, material you're working on, that's a great place to do it. But other than that, I hope everyone found this one helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.